بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
إنك لا تنادي فهبوا يا بني قومي أسودا أعيدوا للدنا أمجاد عصر وفلوا بالحديد لنا القيود.
Hello everyone, this is Colin once again. I'm making this video on another very specific topic. The topic is, of course, referring to chapter 2, verse 256 of the Quran, which is referring to the verse that says there's no compulsion in religion. Verily the truth stands out clear from error. Now, this verse is very important because if you look at the commentary of this verse from modern to classical scholars, it's very clear this verse is specifically referring to the idea that in Islam, Muslims cannot force people to accept Islam. Now, there's been an amazing amount of deception and outright lies done by haters that even I personally have experienced recently with regards to this verse. People will say, like Robert Spencer has said in other places, that this verse was abrogated by Surah 9, verse 5. Now, we are going to deal with this charge of abrogation in a moment, but let us be very clear about one thing. I have made the implication that there's not a single majority scholar, there is not a single consensus anywhere that says that Surah 2, Ayah 256 was abrogated. And that this stands as the consensus and was the consensus at any time in the history of Islam. I would challenge anyone to show me that. I have my translation of the Quran here, the one I'm going to be using in this video to start with, which is the one by Mushin Khan. And I use this translation in this video because it's very good, because the footnotes are specifically referring to classical Tafsirs, the top Tafsirs, Ibn Kathir, Tabari, and things like this, Qurtubi. But it also refers to what scholars back then and today mention about some of these key verses. It also is really handy because in the footnotes it tells you whether a verse has been abrogated. And if we look at chapter 2, verse 256 in this particular translation, let's see here. If I do that with mine right here, I read it. There's no compulsion in religion. Really, the right path has been distinct from the wrong path. Whoever disbelieves in the oneness of God, then he has but if he does believe in Allah, then he has grasped the most trustworthy handhold that will never break. And Allah is the all-hearer, the all-knower. So I look at the footnotes, and look, there's nothing there. The verse hasn't been abrogated. Now, I'm going to post in the description section several links to the Tafsirs, which prove, online at least, that prove that this verse has to do with not being able to convert people. Now, some people make the accusation that, well, let's deal with Surah 9, verse 5 first. I'm now turning to a book by Yasser Qadhi, An Introduction to the Sciences of the Quran, where, what do you know, he actually specifically references this charge that Surah 9, verse 5 abrogates this passage. Now, first off, to understand abrogation, you have to understand that there were some leading scholars, and he has a chart in his textbook, the name of the scholar, how many possible candidates for abrogation, how many verses each scholar thought, and then mentions how many they finally concluded were abrogated. It's important to note that the majority of scholars are convinced that basically there at the most have only been, give or take on average, 7 or 12 cases of abrogation, the least being 5. Now, I'm going to quote his textbook here. He says, with regards to the verse of the sword, meaning chapter 9, verse 5, he says, the verse of the sword is the verse that gave permission for the Muslims to fight the pagans wherever they were, the disbelievers. He quotes the passage. This was one of the last verses to be revealed, and perhaps the last verse that dealt with the treatment of the disbelievers. According to the scholars, there have been over hundreds of cases of abrogation or naskh. Any verse that has had commanded any type of treatment with the disbelievers before this verse was revealed was abrogated by this verse. This is what the haters are saying. He says, for example, when Ibn al-Arabi, of the 105 cases that he stated are examples of naskh, abrogation, no less than 75 were mansukh, meaning that there were 75 verses that were abrogated by the verse of the surah, meaning Surah 9, verse 5. The majority of Ibn Hasam's case are also considered to be mansukh, abrogated because of this verse. In a master's dissertation specifically on this topic, scholar Uthman Ali discussed 147 verses that have been claimed to have been abrogated by the verse of the sword and concluded that only 5 of them can actually be said to be abrogated. He gave a useful categorization of the types of verses that have been claimed to have been abrogated by the verse of the sword, and then he gives several different examples of these verses. Now, if you look at the several examples of the verses, it mentions verses that have really nothing to do with actually fighting the pagans. And so by the end of giving all of these examples, he says, it can be seen from the examples and categories quoted that in reality most of these verses cannot be considered to have been abrogated in the least. Some of them merely apply to situations other than those they were revealed for. Almost all of these mansukh, these verses, can still be said to apply when the Muslims are in a situation similar to the situation in which these verses were revealed. So for my German friend, I've mentioned in other videos, he told me that you cannot look at the Quran from a historical point of view. That's BS, according to the majority of scholars. Also, thus the verse of the sword in reality does not abrogate a large number of verses. In fact, the famous scholar Az-Zarqani concluded that it does not abrogate any verses. Oh, what do you know? And then he continues and says, and another reason for why there exists such a different opinion is that many scholars fail to understand the meaning of the word naskh when used by a companion or successor. As we mentioned earlier, from the word naskh did not necessarily mean abrogation, but rather meant clarification. And he gives examples of this. So again, going back to my video about Surah 9, verse 5, we come that the companions, the people who knew the Prophet and had their own Tafsirs, Ibn Abbas to be precise, and even enshrined in Tabari, the Surah 9, verse 5 is of the type of verse that rather clarifies a subject, as I mentioned in my previous videos, but does not abrogate any of the verses. In fact, I'd like to point out that out of the lists mentioned by these scholars who had this misunderstanding, like Ibn Arabi and Ibn Hazm, no compulsion in religion was actually not part of the five categories. So therefore, this was never really contended to be quote-unquote abrogated. And to this day, the consensus and the majority of scholars say that this was not abrogated in the least bit. Now, some people also mention that, that there's a hadith, very famous hadith, that says that the Prophet ordered to fight people. So for an example, we see here, it says right here, in Sahih Muslim, Umar narrated that the Prophet said, I've been ordered to fight against the people until they testify that there is no God but Allah, and that Muhammad is the messenger of Allah, until they perform the prayers and pay the zakat, the charity. If they do so, they will have gained protection from me, for their lives and property, unless what they do are punishable in accordance to Islam, and their reckoning will be with Allah Almighty. This is the commentary of the 40 hadiths by Imam Nawawi. Quick background, Imam Nawawi was considered one of the greatest scholars on hadith, famous for his collection Rida al-Salin. The commentary then says the following. It says, the majority of scholars say that the people here referred only to the Arab pagans. The same interpretation can also be found in the Quran from in Surah Al-Nisar. Another opinion says the Prophet was referring to all people, excluding the people of the book. It was said that this hadith was abrogated itself by the later ruling concerning the compensation or poll tax in Surah 9, verse 29, as I explained in my previous video. A third opinion interprets this hadith as saying that people have to accept the domination of supremacy of Islam, that Islam is the dominant religion. This objective is to be achieved by whatever means, whether it is through fighting or through peaceful agreements. That is, as the commentator says, the minority opinion. Rather, the majority opinion and mainly consensus is that it is referring to specifically the pagans and not anyone else, and specifically the pagans of Arabia. Now, since we know that the Quran and this hadith has not been shown to actually abrogate, and no scholar says this hadith abrogates Surah 2 verse 256, therefore you cannot bring this hadith forward and say, well, you know, this abrogates, or this actually, you know, you have to answer for this hadith. No, in fact, scholars say that this hadith was probably abrogated by Surah 9 verse 29, if anything. So, therefore, we can see that the idea of forced conversion in Islam does not exist. There is not a place anywhere that the Prophet forced people to convert to Islam. And as the Tafsirs I'll put in the description section clearly prove, especially with Ibn Abbas, who was a companion of the Prophet, knew him personally, shows examples where this hadith directly, with historical circumstances, was meant to say to the Muslims, you cannot force anyone to become a Muslim. And indeed, the early companions, the successors of the Prophet himself, did not force anyone to become a Muslim. Thank you everyone for watching. Peace be with you all.